Madagascar. For as much as I talk about how important it is to replicate natural conditions, you would think that I go to Madagascar to come back chameleon enlightened. And for the most part, that's true. The wild habitat holds the answers we need. But it's important to know that if we want what's best for our chameleon, that the natural world has a lot of dead ends and dangerous conditions. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we can be deceived by what nature shows us. This video shows many looping scenes of my trip to Madagascar. Beautiful visuals, but nothing you need to keep your eyes on. This episode is a deeper discussion, and it's meant to be heard. So whether you're relaxing or doing chores, let the images play and the words do the work. I just need your ears for this one. So sit back and let's talk about the pitfalls of recreating natural conditions in captivity. Chameleons are suited for the environment in which they evolve. The Earth provides a certain set of conditions and seasonal changes. The animals within that environment adapt to survive and benefit from those conditions. This is why some chameleons can handle 100+ degree days running on sand dunes, and some can handle frigid, windswept mountaintops. Our job is to figure out what those conditions are for the chameleon species we are keeping, and to recreate what we can. But oh, that it would be so simple. I say over and over that my husbandry goals are to get closer and closer to nature. That's the quotable side. The truth is that this whole process is very messy. The wild isn't a template for best care that we can just copy. It's a data set we have to interpret. And that interpretation has to be done thoughtfully through the filter of experience. Nature looks beautiful from a distance, but close up it's brutal. Our job in establishing husbandry is to parse out what's healthy and nurturing and what isn't. It's seductive and poetic to say we want naturalistic husbandry. We can even lace it with a little self-righteousness to make ourselves feel good. But behind the scenes, what counts as naturalistic husbandry is anything but clear. But you protest. Isn't it as simple as replicating the wild? Yeah, not quite. You see, we in nature have two completely different goals for chameleons. Nature isn't designed for animal longevity. Nature only ensures that enough chameleons make it to reproductive age to produce the next generation. Once they've reproduced, they often become meals for something else. Even saying nature ensures is giving it too much credit. That's just me anthropomorphizing. Nature doesn't notice chameleons. It doesn't notice us. It's just a collection of conditions that chameleons happen to adapt to. And those conditions are not consistent, barely predictable, and have little respect for life. Nature is just as likely to serve up a deadly drought or a cyclone as it is to offer a balanced season. It doesn't matter how many lives are lost in the process. That's not part of the equation. So when the Disney cameras pack up after capturing that perfect shot of everyone frolicking in the sunlight, the animals go back to surviving. And survival in nature doesn't mean ideal health. It only means they make it to the next day. I'm deliberately focusing on this side of the story because we need to be careful. Just because an animal can survive something doesn't mean we should recreate it. It's the same idea I bring up with captive conditions. Just because a chameleon is alive in a small cage, eating, pooping, and even reproducing, that doesn't mean the setup qualifies as good husbandry. And the same caution applies when we look at nature. Just because a chameleon drinks from a puddle doesn't mean we should start adding puddles to our list of care requirements. Our job isn't to create the conditions that demand survival skills or strive to see the behaviors chameleons use in desperate situations. Our job is to extract the parts of nature that nurture and leave behind the parts that stress the body. On my last trip to Madagascar, we found a female Parsons chameleon in rough shape. One of her eyes was missing. She was emaciated and clearly dehydrated. She had probably escaped a predator and was now trying to hang on through a dry spell during what should have been the wet season. But she was still alert and full of fight. That's the strength of her survival drive. But that doesn't mean we should put her situation in a care guide. Just because she could endure it doesn't mean we should make another chameleon live through it again. Our role as keepers is not to recreate every challenge a chameleon faces in the wild. It is to ask which hardships are truly necessary and which can we remove. You might say, whoa, what do you mean hardships being necessary? I thought we were supposed to filter out the hardships. If only it were that simple. The truth is, sometimes the same conditions that stress an animal are also the ones it depends on. That cool, dry season we're tempted to eliminate, it might be the return of warmth and moisture that triggers breeding. That long, quiet period of rest may be something the immune system relies on to recharge. Even if they survive it, they may also require it. That's the complexity of nature. It's not black and white. And that's why we have so much work to do when we try to figure out what ideal husbandry really looks like. So, where does that leave us? If we want to copy nature, but we can't simply copy nature, just what are we doing? The answer lies in thoughtful observation, analysis, and testing. In other words, a lot of work. So now that we know we have to be thoughtful about what we bring in from nature, where do we start? Well, this is the exact challenge that anyone writing a care sheet has to face. Most care sheets list parameters that have worked for someone, but where did those numbers come from? Maybe a mentor? Somewhere down the line, someone had to make a decision about what to try. And often, the first step was taking clues from the wild. Seems like a natural thing to do, so to speak. The challenge is that nature is not static. There's no single temperature or humidity level. There's an ongoing rhythm of daily, monthly, and seasonal shifts. We have to sift through all that variation to decide what to replicate. If a care guide gives you one set of conditions, then someone has decided that those are the ideal values for a single day. Most care guides go a step further and give day and night values. That adds a second data point, but even then, we are assuming those two values can apply for all 365 days of the year. In some of the Chameleon Academy care guides, you may notice that I include both day and night values, along with differences for wet and dry seasons. That gives us 4 different zones instead of 2. Is that enough? How much downtime do chameleons actually need for long-term health? This brings us back to the dry season. It's often treated as something chameleons simply survive. But that season is also a powerful marker in their lives. It helps them measure time. And when animals measure the seasons, they do it for a reason. Those changes may be triggers for breeding, rest, or egg development. Taking away seasonal variation doesn't remove the biological expectation for it. Evolution has wired these cycles into their systems. The question is, how essential is it for survival, long-term health, and reproduction? If you take dormancy away from a Venus flytrap, its health declines. Take away cold winters from temperate bears, and you may get behavioral issues. Even when seasonal conditions seem harsh, we need to ask whether the animals have come to rely on them in ways we don't fully understand. We already know that Jackson's chameleons, especially the high-elevation Mount Meru variety, benefit from cool nights. These cooler periods act as a natural rest phase. The same is true for some species that rely on the end of the dry season to trigger breeding or for eggs to begin development. This is why the idea of creating one ideal day and repeating it for 365 days should be approached with caution. It's a good start, but it's just that, a start. It is the first crude step in establishing husbandry, not the final word. And even when we try to provide consistent conditions, we're not working in a vacuum. Our own seasons affect lighting, hydration, and ambient temperature. Even when we try to hold things steady, the results will shift depending on where we live. And your local seasonal changes probably don't match those of a rainforest in Madagascar. That adds yet another layer of complexity. The good news is that our most common species, the Panther chameleon, seems to adapt well to both constant conditions and the strange seasonal cues we provide. This is where husbandry becomes a meeting point between our attempt to give them what they need and their ability to meet us part way. As long as their tolerance zone overlaps with what we can offer, we have a working relationship. This is how we humans tend to define hardiness. We ask, how far can an animal drift from its ideal husbandry parameters before problems start? Now, when you say it that way, it doesn't sound like a very fair scale. We take a chameleon that has evolved for precise conditions, that has survived every predator in its native range, and we call it fragile because it won't thrive under the artificial environment we create in our living room where we are comfortable. The more we have to learn and replicate their native environment, the more, quotes, advanced they are. The more they can tolerate our mistakes, the more we call them hardy. So, how do we find these so-called hardy species? One clue is range. Panther chameleons have a wide range along the northern coast of Madagascar, from sea level up to about 1,000 meters. That kind of range suggests adaptability. Carpet chameleons and Furcifer ustuleti, the Malagasy giant chameleon, have even broader ranges. But remember, range is just a clue. It's not a guarantee. Veiled chameleons, for example, come from high elevation mountain valleys, yet they are some of the most adaptable chameleons in the trade. So gather your clues, but be cautious with your conclusions. Panther chameleons have adapted to a wide range of conditions. In some parts of their range, the dry season is devastating. In others, it just means a little less rain. I remember my interview with Ewan Edwards on the audio podcast. We talked about how he found panther chameleons curled up underground, waiting for the wet season. In contrast, when I visited the east coast of Madagascar, I saw panther chameleon eggs hatching, even though the dry season was just around the corner. There is no single dry season in Madagascar. It's a spectrum, not a rule. In some places, there may be a brief lull in rain. In other places, entire ecosystems dry out for months. So if we're trying to explore the dry season in captivity, we can't treat it as a universal blueprint. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It's a complex pattern we need to interpret carefully. Our heroes, the panther chameleons, live in both the harsh areas and the relatively lightly touched areas. This means the severity of their seasonal changes depends on where they're from. In fact, given how widespread they are, you would think that different locales might need different husbandry strategies. But that doesn't seem to be the case. At least we haven't figured out any yet. Is that because they really do have a wide survival range? Or is it because we haven't looked closely enough to detect the subtle differences? Or maybe it's both. Let's just say we still have a lot to learn. But if your panther chameleon slows down during cooler or drier months, that may not be a problem. It might be a memory, something their body still remembers from the rhythms of the wild. And if those rhythms matter, we'll need to think carefully about how we translate them into our captive care. When we're evaluating data from the wild, we need to be careful with our very human tendency to want an answer so badly that we stop at the first one we find. We want to believe we've figured it out. But unless we push to verify that the answer we found was correct, we may end up building a foundation of wrong answers. This shows up clearly in the chameleon community through the use of weather apps. With a few taps, we can get the environmental data for almost anywhere in the world, and it would be so easy to just take those numbers and call it done. But this is where our understanding of gradients and microclimates comes in to save us. When I lead trips to Madagascar, we always do a little exercise. At least once during the trip, we take a temperature reading outside the forest. Then we walk into the forest and take another reading. And it's not just the numbers that tell the story. The experience of walking from the heat into the cool shade explains more than the temperature alone ever could. That contrast makes it clear. What the weather app is reporting isn't what the chameleon is experiencing. So, yes, weather apps are useful for a general sense of what's going on. But the old idea of linking a cage's settings directly to a weather feed, where the cage automatically adjusts to the local climate, is clever in theory. In practice, it's a mistake. The chameleon isn't living in the open air where that climate data comes from. It's moving through shaded leaves, branches, dark corners, and dabbled sunlight. It's choosing where to go based on what its body needs. The better approach is to build a large enough environment that offers gradients and microclimates. Then we let the chameleon take care of itself by choosing where to be. Once we've gathered clues about what conditions we're aiming for, the next question is, how well can we replicate them with the tools we have? Take sunrise and sunset. We've long known that a gradual ramp up and ramp down is better than a sudden flip from dark to light. But for decades, we only had on-off switches. We knew what we wanted, but the technology wasn't there. Now we have dimmable lamps and timers that help us create more realistic transitions. Fogging is another area that still needs a lot of improvement. There's so much potential to make it more natural and more effective, and we're working on that. This is how husbandry evolves. We figure out what nature is doing, then we figure out what we can build. Over time, the gap between these two things gets smaller. We gather clues from nature, but what we bring back usually isn't the answer. It just helps us ask better questions. So if wild chameleons solve their needs by moving through microclimates all day, what happens when we shrink their world down to a single cage? Well, once we shift our mindset and start thinking of the chameleon cage as an environment, something the chameleon moves through, selecting microclimates based on what its body needs, we begin to understand why people say that bigger is better. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of a cage as a container, something that keeps the chameleon from getting away. And yes, part of its job is to keep the chameleon safe from the dangers of free roaming, but more than that, the enclosure is where we build a living environment. All of those gradients and microclimates need space, and not just to exist, but to be large enough that the chameleon can use them effectively. The reality is that the larger the cage, the easier it is to build a multifaceted environment. It costs more, yes. It takes more thought and planning, yes. So no, it's not easier for us to set up. But once it's set up, it becomes much more effective in caring for the chameleon. Smaller cages actually take more skill to get right. Yeah, they're easier to fill up, but in a small space, you can only create a few usable microclimates, and those few options have to be exactly right. You can make it work, but you need expertise to do it well. This is why experienced breeders can often use smaller cages. They know exactly what microclimates are needed and how to produce them. Ironically, many of them don't realize that this is a skill they've developed over time. It just feels natural to them. That's how we end up with people saying that chameleons can live in small cages. And this ties into a much bigger topic, the difference between breeder care and keeper care, which is beyond the scope of today's episode, but it's worth touching on just so you understand why a breeder may advocate for a smaller cage. Now, if that breeder is going to guide you personally and help you get everything dialed in, then go for it. But if you're aiming for best practices, then turn your focus to the largest cage you're able to build within your available space and resources. Let me be clear though. I'm not saying that small cages automatically equal expertise. Yes, it takes skill to make them work, but more often, cages are a sign that a breeder, who likely does have expertise, is working with limited space and needs to house a lot of animals. That decision is driven by logistics, not husbandry ideals. You as a keeper should be focused on husbandry first, especially now as our community shifts toward giving chameleons more enrichment. And in reality, even our largest cages are still a poor substitute for what a chameleon has access to in the wild. The gradients and choices out there are multitudinous, so even in a big cage, we still need to develop the skill to choose which microclimates to recreate. And that leads to the next question. Yeah, see how this works? Everything seems to lead to another question. Anyway, how do we know which conditions matter most? That's where observation and interpretation comes in. See, that's the real challenge. There's no official guidebook. We have to make educated guesses. But, it's not all bad. It's not like we're fumbling around in the dark with mittens on. We do have a solid starting point. We know the general temperature ranges, humidity levels, and light cycles to aim for. From there, we observe. Because even though the chameleon can't talk to us, it does communicate. It stays under the heat lamp until it's done warming up. It drinks until it's hydrated. And if you've been in this long enough, you know that poop moisture is one of the most useful hydration indicators out there. So we pay attention. We create conditions, watch their behavior, and refine based on their response. Then we watch what happens next and adjust again. This is a loop, a feedback cycle. It's not one and done, and it continues for the entire time we keep our chameleon. And we're not just testing the conditions themselves, we're also testing how well we can deliver those conditions, because our tools are limited. Our misters don't really replicate tropical rain. We hope it substitutes for it. Our heat lamps don't mimic sunbeams. Our UVB lights fade quickly with distance. And our foggers push out a stream instead of the soft wrap of a drifting cloud that envelops the chameleon at night. So our job isn't just to figure out what conditions they need, it's also to figure out how to simulate them with the tools we have. And if we have a feedback cycle, then we have to have some way of measuring the response. So how do we measure how well we're doing? In the short term, we can look at appetite, hydration, energy levels, and behavior. But real success is measured in long-term health and longevity. And even then, it's hard to isolate the effect of any one factor during those years of life. A chameleon's life includes dozens of overlapping variables. And as we're talking about doing tests in captivity, let's do a mental exercise. I've said that we take inspiration from the natural world and apply it using our tools. But there's an online group out there that believes we shouldn't look to nature at all. Their thinking is that since chameleons are now in captivity, we should only focus on what's in front of us. Use our gear, run experiments, and just see how that works. At first glance, that may sound similar, but it's actually very different. That viewpoint closes the system. It says, here's what I have, here's what I can do, so I'll just keep tweaking until something works. But that's not solving for the animal's needs. That's solving for convenience. You end up optimizing for the wrong thing. When we keep nature in the conversation, we open the system. We aren't just reacting to what's already possible. We're asking what should be possible. That gives us a direction, a North Star, something to aim for. And that's where progress comes from. When we realize that our tools are falling short, it pushes us to ask better questions and build better equipment. Now, I'm not saying we need to copy the jungle. That's not the goal. The goal is to translate the parts of nature that matter most, to do it well enough that the chameleon recognizes what we're offering. That recognition, that moment of alignment, is where good husbandry lives. And that only happens when we keep nature in the conversation. That is where the new ideas come from. If we use the natural world as our benchmark, we can see exactly where our tools fall short, and that's what drives improvement. That's how we evolve as keepers. Now let's talk about something we've quietly ignored for a long time: seasonality. Most of our husbandry schedules are modeled after the wet season. And that makes sense, in a way. That's when chameleons are most active, visible, and vibrant. It's when babies hatch, adults breed, and there's food and water and activity everywhere you look. But the other half of the year, the dry season, that gets left out. And I think we're starting to realize that maybe we ought to pay some attention to the dry season. You see, the dry season isn't just a time of suffering. It's not just a drought to survive. It's part of the life rhythm. Biology isn't just turned to the supposed good times. It's also shaped by the supposed bad times. The big question is, what parts of the dry season are essential? And we're just starting to ask that. At Chameleon Academy, I've been quietly running tests. Right now, the schedule I use has increased hydration during the wet season months, especially during the night. But the next phase is temperature cycling. I want to explore whether cooler temperatures in the dry season improve long-term health, trigger breeding, or reduce stress. And I want to be clear, I don't know the answer yet. This is a hypothesis I'm working through with observation and care. I mean, it's logical. I'm not saying anything terribly outrageous, but it's going to take some work to figure it out. I'm not here to say that everyone should drop their temperatures in the winter or cut back on food in July. What I'm saying is that this question matters, And as a community, we've been so focused on keeping everything ideal and stable that we've possibly flattened out the very rhythms that chameleons have evolved to expect. It's not about recreating hardship, it's about recognizing when rest is biologically valuable. And it's with these kind of conversations that husbandry starts to evolve, not just in our gear, but in our philosophy. We're learning how to care for animals that are shaped by rhythms we've only begun to understand. So let's stay open and let's keep asking questions. And let's not assume that a flat line is the healthiest pattern. Sometimes it's the change itself that keeps them healthy. Now, there's no official doctrine, no hidden council of the Illuminati handing down sacred husbandry truths. No one has it all figured out. Not me, not anyone else. What we have are models, frameworks, approaches built from observation, trial and error, and not a little bit of frustration. What I'm sharing here isn't perfect. It's just the best I've been able to build so far, and I'll change it the moment I find something better. That's a promise. Tomorrow might be different, but it will never be random. I'll tell you why I change. I'll explain what I learned, and I'll show my work. I know others out there are doing the same. They're just as thoughtful, just as invested. They may land on different conclusions, and at times we may seem to disagree, but I've learned not to mistake that for division. Given enough time and open minds, we might just end up in the same place after having taken different paths to get there. Some people criticize me for being closed-minded when I don't promote certain techniques or ideas, but I want to be clear. I have high standards. I evaluate every idea through the lens of whether it moves us towards a more nurturing, enriching environment for our chameleons. That's my North Star. Not trendiness, not tradition, not popularity. But just because I don't embrace an idea doesn't mean I'm dismissing the person who shared it. I welcome conversation. What I don't support is dressing up convenience or community loyalty as ideal husbandry without scrutiny. And I won't compromise the rigor of what I share to make room for something that hasn't earned its place. Still, I don't believe in unchanging truths. In fact, if I go 5 or 10 years without revising part of my husbandry, I'll be concerned. Either I've stopped learning or I've stopped listening. Both are dangerous places to be. This entire outreach, from the podcast to the website to the virtual campus, is built on the idea that husbandry evolves. I don't want a community that defends a fixed model. I want a community that refines it together. Now, I also want to acknowledge the real human side of this. Change is hard, especially in public, especially in an online culture that rewards takedowns over dialogue. It's easy to say, we respect people who admit they're wrong. But in practice, that vulnerability often gets weaponized. It's no wonder that people in visible roles, admins, moderators, creators, start out open and end up defensive. It's a survival mechanism. Social media doesn't usually reward humility. It punishes perceived weakness. And so people double down, not because they're arrogant, but because they're trying to protect something they care about. That doesn't excuse defending an incorrect piece of husbandry, but it helps explain it. So if you ever wonder why it's so hard to shift the culture of a group or why some communities seem stuck in old ways, it's not just about the husbandry. It's about the human dynamics underneath. And listen, I say all of this not to judge, but to make space for something better. If what you're doing is working, if your chameleons are healthy, your routine's stable, and your spirit at peace, then there's no pressure to change. You don't have to chase every new idea. All I ask is that you stay honest about where you are and stay open to where you might go. If you decide not to adopt something new, that's fine. Just don't turn your stance into a wall that blocks progress for others. We're all building our direction, our focus, our North Star. My hope is that this community helps you sharpen yours and reminds you that the best compass is the one you're willing to recalibrate. So, why did we gather today? We came together to look at one of the most important, yet challenging, ideas in chameleon care, using nature as a guide, not a template. We've explored how wild conditions give us direction, how our tools fall short, and how our models must remain flexible and alive. We've challenged assumptions, acknowledged disagreements, and hopefully reminded ourselves that husbandry is not about proving you're right, it's about getting it right. The takeaway is simple but powerful. Stay curious. Keep learning. Use nature to ask better questions, and don't settle for what's easy. Aim for what your chameleons actually need. Because when we stay focused on their world, not just our convenience, that's when we start building something worth sharing. I know it's very easy for us to say that we just follow the naturalistic world, and that is what I say, and obviously I believe that's the way to go. But we have to acknowledge that that includes a lifetime of interpretation, which I suppose is a good thing because it means we're not going to get bored anytime soon. And so, just get ready for the adventure. Now, if you're on this adventure but still have questions, I invite you to join me in the Chameleon Academy for our weekly live sessions. I've just started a new YouTube channel dedicated to our live sessions. It's called Chameleon Academy Live, and the link to that channel is in the description. These live sessions are held Tuesday night at 5 p.m. Pacific and Saturday at 12 noon Pacific. We do hang out on Sunday evening at 5 p.m. Pacific, but that's more just as a community hangout. We like to say hello. It's got a great community feel. And you're invited to that one too. These are the perfect places for you to ask questions and get answers in real time. And with that, I want to say thank you for joining me. Learn, understand, pass it on, and be excellent to each other. This is Bill Strand signing off. I'll see you next time.